One is people actually being impacted health-wise, even dying because of disinformation. And the other one, of course, being the impossibility of trying to contain the virus. So I think that from the beginning of the crisis, it was evident that we needed to have a sensible distribution of information.
We need a robust policy framework that ensures resilience of society, while at the same time protecting freedom of expression, and quality journalism and trust in media are key.
We really need a multidisciplinary whole of society approach in order to understand and address the impact of the infodemic.
Firstly, that rumors cross borders really, really quickly. And that whilst we tend to think about these problems as a nation state, we really should be thinking globally and doing more to think about translation and understanding how that works.
Researchers need to be able to access data for research purposes. And this is true because it's only by understanding the phenomenon that you can tackle it. If you want to put it in medical terms, you need to have a clear diagnosis to actually have the therapy.
Our efforts should not be isolated. It should really be well coordinated, because if our efforts are not coordinated, then our ability to address the infodemic will be not as impactful.
Secondly, things that used to be kind of conspiratorial and in the fringes, the idea that, for example, 5G was causing COVID, or Bill Gates was putting microchips into vaccines, those kind of things became much more mainstream than we'd seen before, partly because people were terrified during the pandemic. And so these kind of things that would have been outlandish actually became more mainstreamed because people were looking for explanations to understand why their worlds had changed so much.
It was very good for us to have already in place the framework of the code of practice on disinformation, because that allowed us to, have a continuous exchange of information with the platform to understand what they were doing to tackle disinformation related to COVID-19, and also to push them to do more.
During an emergency, either, like an acute public health event or like a protracted, longer emergency, I think what we've learned is that health information becomes really valued personally, and also trust becomes very important. Outside of emergencies, humans, we tend to, passively consume health information, but during an acute public health event, health information is, increasingly relevant to everyone. People start actively seeking health information and then try to navigate this overabundance of information through others that they trust. So this means that people have sort of a heightened receptivity for health-related information. But then on the other hand, we have an increase in generation of health information from a variety of different sources. Many people are writing or talking about COVID. And then there's this tension between wanting to find answers to questions right away. But the fact is that, science takes time. Science is iterative, and it usually takes a very long time to arrive at definitive answers.
Not underestimate the role of neurological and psychological element when dealing with disinformation. The pandemic showed us how being locked in our homes and fearing for our health made us all being more online, but also liking and sharing more irrationally content.
Disinformation is something that occurs more and more across platforms, across countries, and across languages. So it is an all-encompassing phenomenon that we cannot limit to one online environment.
Whilst it's important to think about misinformation, we should really think about the wider information supply chain. So ultimately, the failings of health authorities, governments, journalists to fill those voids, to answer people's questions about the pandemic, about the vaccine, meant that vacuums emerged online that were then filled by conspiracy theorists and people who were trying to push false and misleading information. So we need to think about the whole ecosystem, not just working on combating the disinformation. We need to be better at giving people quality information.
We need a collaborative response. We need a response and efforts that bring together platforms, researchers, journalists, scientists, policymakers, and civil society as a whole, because this is the only way that we can efficiently counteract disinformation.
The pandemic that we've had running over more than 2 years by now, and the so-called infodemic, that has really shown that a lot is at stake, and that a lot still needs to be done in order to protect our democracies and also counter those actors who do not wish us well, put it like that. And that is another learning I would point out from my side, although that is nothing new, that there's always been malicious actors or so, but this really became very obvious during the pandemic, and also relating now to the current situation with the war in Ukraine. It has become very, very obvious in those past 2 or so years.
Dis and misinformation are part of the infodemic, but that scope, that focus on misinformation alone is, I think, too narrow. I think we need to, have a broader perspective, because, like I said earlier, during this infodemic, people have not only been exposed to dis and misinformation, but struggling just as much with, once accurate, but now outdated information, with information overload, and even, just with fundamental confusion. And yes, digital platforms are, the original breeding ground of these, types of misinformation. But incredibly fast pace of this infodemic comes from how it spreads from online spaces to offline interactions with, your family, friends, and maybe even like your healthcare providers, and not just through, text messages or written text, but, through photos, videos, different types of mediums. So it's really a much broader than, what people usually think of when they hear the term infodemic.
Ultimately, there was a disproportionate focus on political disinformation in 2016, 2017, 2018. What the pandemic taught us is what the rest of the world already knew, which is the biggest problem has always been health and science misinformation. And one thing this infodemic has shown us is that this has to be given more resources, more thinking, more strategic response. And whilst elections seem sexy and what everybody should think about, fundamentally, we've got serious problems with misinformation when it comes to politics, health, war, climate, hate, all of these different elements. And so we need to stop thinking in silos and think about the tactics, techniques, and sources and actors who cross all of those different topics.
Very often, financial incentives are the one that drives this information. There are, of course, a broad set of malicious actors that try to gain from this information, but certainly those ones that look after having financial gains are major actor in the ecosystem. And of course, that was an important lesson learned.
Online and the offline world are one thing, and they are strongly interconnected between one another, and that the online does not simply mirror what happens offline, but it amplifies it. It turns it into sometimes extremist and polarized behavior.
The experience with the pandemic enable us to have a better picture of where we need to improve. And therefore, we use the experience of the pandemic to really set out a set of requests to the online platform and to the signatory of the code of practice to improve the code.
And during the pandemic, it has proven more important than ever for people to access accurate information and sort the facts from fiction. If you're asking about 3 learnings from the pandemic, I would say it's the importance of a truly complex approach to content moderation, the value of collaboration, and the importance of media literacy. First of all, the pandemic confirms that simply removing violative content is not enough. Raising authoritative information, reducing the spread of low-quality information, and rewarding content creators and publishers is equally important when it comes to moderating content at scale. Second, let me speak about collaboration. Helping the world understand information during a health crisis requires a broad response involving scientists, journalists, public health authorities, tech platforms, and many others. And since the beginning of the pandemic, we've been working with partners around the world to ensure that our users get the information they want, the answers that they need, and the accuracy that they deserve. Let me use a few examples. Through the Google News initiative, we have provided digital verification trainings to more than 100,000 European journalists. On YouTube, we were elevating authoritative sources from health authorities to help users get the latest and most up-to-date information. These information panels have served over 400 billion impressions around the world.
Our approach to COVID-19 misinformation is 3 pillars, and in each of those pillars, we learned a valuable lesson. The first pillar is to promote authoritative information. That means making sure our users can easily find reliable information on COVID-19, but also on the COVID-19 vaccine and how to get vaccinated. The key lesson we learned here, though, is the importance of social norming. Public health experts have explained that a person is much more likely to get vaccinated if they see someone else in their own community doing so. That's why we worked with local partners to design profile frames. And since launch, 18 million people globally have used these profile frames.
The importance of good research infrastructure. This we have learned in the hard way, I would say, and it is not something that is done yet. It's not perfect, the infrastructure that we have, and we have experienced that especially in the light of COVID. Here, things had to speed up, and we had to try to speed up our work a lot because there was a large interest from society, policymakers, etc., for us to show our work and to show the findings that we can generate. However, we have a lot of challenges in having accessible data. So the idea of who's doing what, where, how was also very important in the light of COVID-19 in relation to research. Having an overview, an infrastructure in research that allows us to see which groups are doing what, so that we are not answering the same questions with the same data.
The second pillar is to remove harmful misinformation on COVID-19. That is, misinformation claims on COVID-19 that can lead to harm of our users. And here the lesson was an extremely humbling one, and it was that this process is constantly iterative and never ends. And we need to keep on top of upcoming trends, but also continuously get input from public health experts, including the WHO, to understand what these claims are and identify them. The third pillar is to deal with borderline content that may not breach our COVID-19 misinformation policies, but still includes misinformation and could potentially lead to vaccine hesitancy. Here we've leaned heavily on our network of fact-checkers and our fact-checking program, which includes over 80 different fact-checkers that work to cover more than 60 languages in the world. And we learned a very encouraging lesson here, which is that labeling content works. We saw that over 90% of our users who see a label on a piece of content noting that it was rated by fact-checkers proceed not to click on it.
Good news is that our research suggests that most people were quite well informed about coronavirus as a disease, They were very likely to follow health advice, in particular if politicians and health authorities were communicating the same message. And they very rarely believed in some of the most commonly made false or misleading claims about coronavirus vaccines, for example, unless such claims were made by major politicians in their country of origin. The bad news, of course, is that the pandemic very powerfully reminded anybody who had forgotten this that misinformation is real. It is a widespread problem, in particular online, and in particular on some social media platforms such as Facebook or YouTube or various messaging applications. And that in a context of a deadly disease, it's a question of life and death. In particular, when that misinformation comes from sources that people may have reasons to believe, may trust. So the role here of major politicians, faith leaders, and various experts is incredibly important.
Then having international collaborations with a view to comparing and validating larger studies across regions and countries was also important because this was a global crisis. Last part of the lesson learned on infrastructure importance is interdisciplinarity. That these were problems that we had to solve in a very short time on data that were not very accessible. But having a group of people with different perspectives allowed us to actually move in or solve a bigger problem in shorter time. And that was also a lesson learned, that it was actually fruitful to have a connection across fields as well.
In a world in which our research suggests that while there are small minorities who were demonstrably misinformed about coronavirus vaccines, for example, often because they believed prominent elite actors who made false misleading claims about these things, and in which the clear majority seemed to be well-informed and relied on trustworthy sources, it's also the case that there is a silent minority of people that we in our research call the infodemically vulnerable. These are people who are not routine users of independent news media. They don't use news on a regular basis, and who don't trust independent news media. So it's not just that they don't use them, it's also that if they were to begin to use them, they wouldn't necessarily give credence to the information that they contain. And this group, the infodemically vulnerable, these are not the people who are sort of vocal anti-vaxxers or spreading bogus so-called cures or protesting in the streets. These are citizens who are uncertain about what to do, who feel quite distant, even alienated from established media and often from establishment politics as well, and who are fundamentally very unsure as to who they can count on to navigate a challenging situation such as the pandemic. It's a pretty large group. In some countries, we would estimate 10% or more of the population as being infodemically vulnerable.
And here we know from studies that disinformation and misinformation, false information if you want, travels faster and further than true information. That we know. The same goes for negative sentiment, which is people talking in a negative tone about things. That also will increase the speed. So our study that is now published in Big Data and Society show that this negative sentiment is not found in all COVID-19 related information, disinformation. But we only found this negative sentiment to some types, and that is conspiracy theories and virus characteristics. We were also comparing English fact checks in Pointer and Google as two of the largest databases covering COVID-19 mis and disinformation. And that study showed that they have different biases towards certain platforms, for instance, Facebook, certain regions of the world, certain sources, and etc. And also actually certain types of COVID-19 stories are covered by different infrastructures. This has, of course, different implications. First of all, it shows that one infrastructure is not enough to cover all aspects. So in this way, I believe that more infrastructures benefit society. What I think is there's a room for improvement is to highlight these biases more by the infrastructures themselves, so that it can be visible for the users of the infrastructure what they are actually getting. So can I expect this infrastructure to cover the whole world? Maybe not, but what are the parts of the world that are covered most? What are the platforms they mostly cover? What are the regions that they mostly cover, the sources, etc.?
The general picture is such that if we don't have a common understanding of what the basic facts are, it's impossible to have public discourse. I would actually argue that without basic facts and understanding of information or reading media, you cannot have democracy.
Disinformation comes out from the closed bubbles of conspiracy theorists and finds support in political discourse and in traditional media. It can produce way more damages. For example, we investigated the situation in the 2 countries with the highest vaccination rate at some point, I don't remember exactly the month, and 2 with the lowest vaccination in Europe, of course, in the European Union. The 2 best ones were Ireland and Portugal, with around 98-99% of the people that can be vaccinated. And the 2 with the worst data were Bulgaria and Romania, with, if I remember correctly, around 20-something and 30-something% of vaccinated people. So we asked our colleagues from Bulgaria, Romania, Ireland, and Portugal about the reasons of this situation and the role of false news and disinformation. And yes, of course, disinformation played a role, but the smaller one. The bigger role was played by the different situation, of course, about trust in authorities, education of the people, welfare, of course, of the people, and in general, of course, the social and economic situation in the country. But 2 very, very important elements were that in Ireland and Portugal, the political class was very unified with very few exceptions around the facts about the vaccines and the vaccination. Where in Bulgaria and Romania, the political class was polarized around the facts of the pandemic and of the vaccination. And consequently, in the Portuguese and Irish traditional media, conspiracy theories, disinformation didn't find any support, didn't find place. Where in Bulgaria and Romania, also traditional media hosted politicians, so-called self-appointed experts, and other subjects spreading disinformation and false news around the vaccination. And that, I think, is a very important lesson, also because we see something similar right now with the situation in Ukraine.
There's a variety of actors involved, and they have different underlying motivations and aims and goals. And these are, for example, just like a small selection or so. People want to make money with it. They want to sow discontent. They want to undermine democracies. They want to gain relevance or attract attention, or some just do it for the sake of it or for the fun of it. And of course, many, many more. Now, if we want to counter disinformation, be it in a pandemic or any other context, we also have to do so in a sort of multifaceted or multi-layered way. That means bringing together various actors and joining forces. There's no one entity that can do it alone. Plus, we as a society, we also need to, I think, come up with some form of agreement or common understanding of what is desirable and what is not.
The pandemic confirmed that we need a body like EDMO that gathers stakeholders and evidence with a multidisciplinary approach. The infodemic proved how tackling disinformation is a collective exercise that needs expertise from different fields.
And we as information disseminators, we have to really try and reach these different parts of society as well as possible. And this is really a core challenge that also became obvious to me, at least during the pandemic, and that also in a way requires us to address a number of questions and ask ourselves permanently, get feedback whether we really achieve what we think we are aiming at. Are the means appropriate that we are using? If not, we need to readjust them, and we need to do that constantly. Are the intended messages getting out to our targeted audiences or our recipients? And do they have impact? Are the goals that we have set ourselves, are they being reached?
You can convince a lot of skeptical people with facts, explanation, patience, and non-antagonizing attitude, but you can't convince them all. So you don't have to chase the irredeemable minority, but it's better to focus the efforts on the majority's legitimate concerns. So you have to address the people that are genuinely scared or worried or not well informed, but that are not a lost cause.
The pandemic showed how it is important to work on the monetization of disinformation. We saw, for example, that often disinformation related to COVID-19 was actually boosted by financial incentives of the spreaders. So it is really important to continue the work on the monetization of disinformation.
I think we as media organizations also need to aim to get the widest possible support from society and its constituent parts as possible. Consuming disinformation can have very serious consequences. It can seriously impact people's lives, as we've seen. It can harm and it can even kill individuals. It can also undermine democracies, impact election outcomes and such like. And that is why it is important, I think, to take adequate measures against disinformation being spread, and that requires various levels, equipping individuals with tools, tactics, knowledge, know-how in how to act and behave. And also, that's a personal view, it requires a strong and a trusted media ecosystem.
Because we saw that the communities that were exposed to disinformation and conspiracy theories about a specific topic like the pandemic are in grave danger of being exposed to disinformation also about other topics. So now in particular, the war in Ukraine. We detected in many European countries of the European Union, this worrying phenomenon. COVID-19 conspiracy theorists pivoted to pro-Russian hoaxes in few days after the beginning of the war. And of course, there are a million reasons why someone could be no mask, anti-vaxxers, or against the COVID-19 related restrictions, without him or her necessarily being pro-Russia, pro-Putin. But if after 2 years of pandemic, you started trusting these alternative channels of information and you have lost trust in traditional media, so you don't believe the newspapers, you don't believe the news that are aired on television by traditional media, you don't believe the work of fact-checkers, you don't believe anything that is not that alternative channels because they are the only one that actually tell the truth, and you started thinking that during the pandemic. Now, if those channels start feeding you with pro-Russia propaganda and pro-Russia disinformation, you are at great risk to believe those false information that you're provided.
And what I found really interesting learning is the role of emotions and feelings in all this. Now, that's something I found quite interesting, that emotions and feelings, they seem to play quite a significant role when it comes to judging whether someone or something is true or false, right or wrong. And thus trying to influence individuals also increasingly, it seems to me, appeal to people's, which often also equals the electorate's, feelings and emotions rather than the fact. And in turn, I found it rather interesting, astonishing, scary, how little scientific research methods or science in general, how little is known in that space and how little numerous people trust in science and research. I found it really very interesting to discover how little is known generally in the population or in large parts of the population, how little is known about how science and research, how it is conducted, how it works, how scientists and researchers come to conclusions, how falsification is done, and so on and so forth. And in turn, what I said before, the fact that emotions play such a large or considerable role, contrary to scientific-based evidence, this really is something very interesting, but also something I find quite concerning. And we have to support individuals in really making sense of this world, of this world that is becoming more and more complex, and turn them even more into critical thinkers.
Fighting COVID-19 related disinformation quickly became our daily main occupation. The disinformation in general is an ancillary phenomenon to the information. It follows where the information goes. So in a time when the pandemic was the biggest issue in every newscast and in every newspaper, I think it's normal that the same happened in the disinformation bubble and consequently in our job.
The COVID-19 pandemic impacted the work of all of us. In the information sector, it reminded about the key role played by media and institutions, and also the importance about trust in media and institutions.
I sort of, with hindsight, start to understand how important it was for me personally to understand what was going on. I got a lot of statistics. I did a lot of comparisons. I sort of tried to siphon out the information from the disinformation. And I think it was the same thing for all of us, in the sense that we had to keep on getting information to understand what was going on. Sometimes we got it wrong. So in the beginning, I might have been thinking, are these masks a good thing or a bad thing? And then I came to the conclusion, well, based on the evidence that I've read from reliable sources that had been fact-checked, masks are actually a good thing to protect you and your environment. Once you started to condense all the information into one big picture, we all got an understanding what it meant to be living in the middle of the pandemic, what it meant to be able to contain it, and what it meant to be in human interaction. So I learned a lot through the pandemic, also about information and disinformation.
And for sure, as everyone knows, we had more to do during COVID-19 because, as I already said, people used only digital media, primarily because they were isolated. So we saw a lot of information in general going out in during the pandemic. And the digital media were also used as the official channel by politicians and health institutions, etc. So of course there was a lot of things floating that we had to collect and monitor and analyze and publish on.
Because of course not all the topics are equally important and potentially dangerous. The pandemic was probably the most appalling case we saw in our years of activity, because of course it's about health, and if people start being disinformed about vaccination and end up not vaccinating themselves, they can die. I mean, it's really the most dangerous example I can think about. Even the war in Ukraine, if you want, is not as much dangerous by the point of view of the single individual person living here in Italy.
Therefore, we issue very quickly a new communication on how to tackle disinformation related to COVID-19, and I think that was the starting point of a much let's say stronger response to tackle the phenomenon of disinformation. And the three pillars were like strategic communication in order, also to protect the effort of the European institution. An improved cooperation within the European institution and with the member states, and a strengthened cooperation with major online platforms.
A lot of people expected speed from our side, and that was very difficult to provide because it was difficult and it was very chaotic, and we had to make sure that our findings actually were supported, and the idea that policy was maybe more wanted before things were peer reviewed, and we really appreciate the peer review process for research as well, because it validates what we find and also pinpoint potential shortcomings and maybe to bold conclusions that could actually, if it is released too early, can have a negative effect on society. So it's something that is a balance, right? And it's definitely something that that characterized our work a lot, to balance these interests of speed versus depth and validation.
Have really been faced with this full impact of how much technology progress has changed how we connect with each other, how we make decisions, how we enact health behaviors, and how we influence each other in personal and professional spheres.
Harmful content, including disinformation, is one of the greatest challenges these days. And we recognize our responsibility in this fight, and we believe that we are part of the solution. We constantly review and we update and we diligently enforce our policies against harmful content. Our COVID-19 medical misinformation policies prohibit claims that contradict health authorities. This includes claims that the COVID-19 vaccines kill people, or claims that 5G towers transmit COVID. Throughout the pandemic, we've blocked over 100 million coronavirus-related ads from EU-based advertisers. For example, ads that make misleading claims about cures and vaccines, or those that capitalize on global shortages.
Infodemic management can be more effective if we recognize the societal dynamics influence how our public health system works, how people experience our work, and how we ourselves as public health professionals work. So we can't solve societal problems all through the health system alone, as I mentioned earlier. And we certainly cannot solve the infodemic through the health system alone. But it is our responsibility as practitioners to think about what's in the domain of influence of health authorities and what can be changed within our domain, so that we promote the better uptake of epidemic mitigation measures by people, and especially with vulnerable and at-risk communities.
As you can see, the pandemic has really required a complex approach and a collaboration of many partners, and we've been fully committed to get this right.
How can we help people along the journey towards healthy behaviors? So our health system and our practices must be focused on humans, how we are designing our services and our communication, so that people feel that they own the decision to take steps towards healthy behaviors. So that's what I mean by focusing on humans. So the way that I like to think about it is that actually we as public health practitioners need to work at the interface with society, with populations, and with communities. So to this end, one of our priority areas has been to develop methodologies for understanding the impact of infodemics, really at the community level, in a way that allows us to rapidly produce insights for responding to community level challenges.
I'm also a social scientist, and it means that my first obligation is to the best obtainable version of the truth. And I think it's particularly important in a context such as the coronavirus pandemic to really make sure that if we think a particular institution in society, in my case, the news media and profession, might play an important role and perhaps even a role that is positive, a role that helps people navigate a difficult and challenging situation, that we're sure that we don't just assume it, that we don't just take the words of people who work in a profession, in this case journalism, but it could be anything really, and don't just take it on their word that they are in fact helping people, but investigate it and find evidence. So that's what we set out to do at the Reuters Institute, because we need to remember, of course, that there are issues on which it is the case that relying on independent journalism and news media sometimes leave people less informed. People who follow the news are liable to see violent crime as far worse in society than it actually is. They often also vastly overestimate the problems that might associate immigration in a society.
We've removed more than 24 million pieces of content on Facebook and Instagram that violated our COVID-19 misinformation policies. We also removed more than 3,000 different pages, accounts, or groups that repeatedly violated these same COVID-19 misinformation policies. And we've applied labels to more than 195 million pieces of content to note that they were rated by fact-checkers. Finally, we worked closely with the Carnegie Mellon University and the Maryland University on the biggest COVID-19 survey of its kind to date. This survey covers COVID-19 symptom, testing, and vaccination rates, among other factors, and it includes 70 million responses from people in over 200 countries and territories.
We are also heavily focused on providing practical tools that would enable practitioners around the world to tackle the infodemic in their own local context and in their own communities.
Thought, this is a moment in which it's really important that journalists and news media understand their role in society, have access to independent evidence-based analysis of how that is working, and that other actors, citizens, but also elected officials and policymakers and the like, have access to information about, what is the impact of journalism or other forms of media and media use in a context like that.
We worked a lot during the 2 years of the pandemic, trying to clear the facts, to give the people the best information possible, and really to counter the false information that were constantly spread throughout televisions, newspapers, and social media. It's not something that was limited to the internet and the web, but also in traditional media, we witnessed a lot of disinformation on the first pages of newspapers and in prime time.
It's added another dimension to my areas of work and research, and it also resulted in me having to get some basic knowledge, at least a basic topical knowledge in some areas of which I knew very, very little before, be it I can't even pronounce the word, epidemiology, I leave it, or virology, that's an easier one. I had all these medical fields, of which I was definitely not an expert and still am not, but at least to understand a bit better what was going on required me to sort of read specialist articles and consult especially a number of specialists, listening regularly to experts who know a lot more. So this was one impact, and that of course also resulted in it taking a lot of time. I mean, getting into such a topic of which I didn't know anything or had next to nothing requires a hell lot of time to get at least some basic understanding. So I will be interested. I have no idea, I have no clue, but it would be interesting to find out how much time that took. And the day only has 24 hours. So this was some impact. Now, from an information science and media related perspective, it's sort of resulted in me asking slightly new questions and also investigating different questions, or topically they were different. The questions generally were similar or the same, but they were slightly more nuanced or in a slightly different context. What I mean by that, I mean, when you work on disinformation, we asked ourselves in teams, how does information spread in this particular topical context, namely the medical / pandemic / virology COVID context, including disinformation? Can we see same patterns as we've seen before? Do we see new patterns, or are there any difference?
Knowledge and susceptibility to misinformation. And we also looked at more specific problems, such as those around misinformation and fact-checking, in particular on social media, to make sure that when journalists and editors make their decisions in this really challenging environment, that they have access to analysis to inform that decision-making. That when politicians and other decision makers in society were thinking about, well, what can we do to ensure that the citizenry are well informed and have access to information that help them make decisions to protect themselves and their loved ones and take good care of one another in this crisis, what does the research say about what helps? That they had access to research that wasn't 3 years later, but actually available as these decisions were being made in real time. So that was a huge change, and I'm very, very grateful to the whole team here and all our collaborators for how we were able to very quickly turn around and I think make some modest contributions to inform decision-making during the pandemic.
Recent events have helped us confirm and reinforce our priorities. And as we have seen, for instance, in the twin crisis of the pandemic and Ukraine war, this is something that we discussed in the report that we wrote as EDMO Deluxe. Well, there is a pattern there, and it's not just these two crises, but also other situations as disinformation around elections, around civil rights. We see patterns there, and this means that the type of response that we need to have is not just an ad hoc one, but a systematic one.
Information, it's not only a time thing, so it's not just the evolution of the number of cases, but also about topics. For example, at the beginning of summer, when people started looking for vacations and, to book an airplane, this information started targeting the pilots. They were dying because of the COVID-19 vaccines. And so if or other false news I can remember is the one about if you are vaccinated, you cannot take the plane because you are at high risk or having a heart attack or other heart-related problems.
I'm working for a public service media organization. I was also very interested in covering all this. I mean, we as a media, as a broadcaster, as a media or multimedia broadcaster or multimedia organization doing radio, television, audio, video, text, of course, we have to find appropriate ways to cover such a situation and do so as well as possible, and also counter disinformation on a journalistic level. And this led me, as someone who's working in applied research, to try and have as many exchanges as possible with our editorial team. Especially we have a fact-checking unit, so I really try to exchange thoughts and ideas as much as possible with them or with the head to understand what their challenges are, how they deal with it, how they tackle it, and how we, on the other hand, as a research team, can maybe also support and how we can bring all that together.
The amount of disinformation we detected for many months followed with some hiatus, with some time between, a similar evolution of the number of COVID-19 cases. So when the cases were growing, the amount of disinformation detected related to COVID-19 grew. And of course, when the cases started dropping, also the disinformation detected related to COVID-19 pandemic, after a while, started falling down.
Then again, the impact, what impact does all of this have? Sometimes it's quite worrying, I think, when it comes to information being spread or disinformation, and what impact does it have on the well-being of consumers, of information consumers or recipients of information or disinformation? How do they react as a result? Does it have any long-term, possibly negative consequences on their mental well-being? Interesting questions.
And so we need to move from a situation of crisis management to building resilient communities that are able to counteract this phenomenon. And to do so, we need funding and we need transparency.
I have been, or we as Deutsche Welle have been involved in a research project co-financed by the European Commission that is called We Verify. And the project concluded or finished in late 2021. And there's quite a number of results that came out of it. And one component or one part of it, of which we are extremely proud, is a so-called We Verify verification plugin, which is a freely available tool that can be used by journalists, fact checkers, human rights investigators, what have you, to investigate audio, video, text or so. And we're very proud that this has now over 70,000 monthly users and over 50,000 weekly users. And it's a de facto, or one of the de facto must-haves for the verification community.
EDMO started a couple of months after the outbreak of the pandemic, and this actually unfortunately confirms the need and importance of such an observatory. Our priorities have not changed, rather they were reinforced, unfortunately, by the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. Given its role as a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder platform, we were actually hoping to start, of course, in person, but I think that despite that, we managed to build a very strong community, and we look forward to our collaboration in person now with the stakeholders involved.